Good evening and welcome to the District of Sechelt Council meeting of Wednesday, July 6th. It is 7 p.m. and I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Sechelt Nation. So we have an agenda in front of us. First, are there any declarations of conflict on this agenda or with any item in this agenda? Being none, I'd look for a motion to adopt the agenda as presented. Moved and seconded, all in favor? Thank you. And then I'd look for a motion to receive the staff reports. Moved, seconded, all in favor. Thank you. No appointments and delegations or proclamations. So move to item number 5. This is the adoption of the minutes of the 7 p.m. regular council meeting of June 15th. First, any errors or omissions in these minutes? Being none, I'd look for a motion to adopt. Moved and seconded, all in favor. Thank you. Any business arising from the minutes? Seeing none, I will get to the next item in my agenda package. Item 7.1 is the receipt of committee of the whole meeting minutes of June 8th. These are for receipt and endorsement. So any errors or omissions in these minutes? Seeing none, I'd look for a motion for receipt and endorsement. Moved, seconded, all in favor. Thank you. Item number 7.2, Sechelt Sewer Facilities Commission meeting minutes of June 15th for receipt. Again, any errors or omissions in these minutes? I'd look for a motion to receive. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Is the only rep from the nation Alvina?
I believe she's the primary, her and Jesse Waldorf. And then the alternate for Alvina is Warren Paul.
Have any of them ever showed up to a meeting?
Jesse comes to the meetings.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, item 7.3, District of Sechelt annual meeting minutes of Wednesday, June 24th. And this is for receipt and endorsement. Again, any errors or omissions in these minutes? Seeing none, I'd look for a motion to receive and endorse. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. Moving to bylaws. Item 8.1A. This is the housing agreement for 5638 Inlet Avenue, Sunshine Coast Community Services Society, and I'd look to our Senior Development Planner, Mr. Korbowitz. Over to you.
Thank you. I don't have a presentation for this, but this is the housing agreement that is part of the zoning amendment that was done for community services. A condition of constructing the building at the height limit that was provided is registration of a housing agreement to secure the units as affordable housing. The housing agreement is included for first 3 readings, and happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Council, any questions? Seeing no questions. Councilor McLean, go ahead. Okay, missed you when I went around.
Sorry, I'm trying to find my notes here too. So, but it was something to the extent of the term for these 2 housing agreements are different. I believe the one for the Uptide is a shorter term than this one for community services. I was just wanting a little bit more information about why they have a different term.
Sure, I can answer that question. Sure. Partially as a result of negotiations with the various applicants, and 60 years is also the standard term for BC Housing and the province, who will be the main operator of this facility. So that's where they provided the 60-year term on that. The 40-year term is more appropriate for the market rental, since community services is fully subsidized housing.
Perfect. So it's really BC Housing driving that. So good to know. Thank you.
All right. Any further questions or comments? All right. There is a recommendation on this page. This is page 28. And what would council like to do? Councillor Toth.
Thank you. I'll move recommendation 2 that council give first, second, and third reading to housing agreement bylaw 603/2022 for 5638 Inlet Avenue.
Is there a seconder for the recommendation? Seconded. All those in favor? Thank you. So if we move to the bylaw, 8.1B, this is District of Sechelt bylaw number 603-2022, a bylaw to authorize a housing agreement, and I look for someone to move first reading. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. And then District of Sechelt bylaw number 603-2022, a bylaw to authorize a housing agreement. Someone move second reading. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. And District of Sechelt bylaw number 603-2022, a bylaw to authorize a housing agreement, and someone to move third reading. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. Moving on to item 8.2. Let me do it this way, it's faster. Item 8.2, this is a housing agreement for 5680 Ebtide Street. This is Ebtide Developments Limited. And Mr. Kobowitz, over to you.
Thank you. Likewise, I don't have much to say to this one. This is for adoption as it was previously considered by council for third reading.
Thank you. Council, any questions? All right, there is a recommendation on page 46. Someone like to move that? Okay. Councillor Toth, that housing agreement bylaw number 604-2022, 5680 Ebtide Street be adopted. Is there a seconder?
That's exactly what I said.
Seconded. All those in favor? Thank you. So we'll move to the actual bylaw. This is bylaw number 604-2022. So District of Sechelt bylaw number 604-2022, a bylaw to authorize a housing agreement, and look for someone to move adoption. Moved. Seconded. All in favor? Thank you. No new business, so we move on to item number 10. Thank you, Mr. Kowitz. Item 10.1. Yep, go ahead.
The bylaw 8.1B might be just a typo because we gave it third reading, but there's a public hearing in between second and third reading on the bylaw.
Mr. Kowitz? Yeah. You just want to address that?
Thank you. We'll be sure to correct that.
So in other words, we don't do a public hearing for that one. It's just, yeah, that's a mistake on there.
It's just listed there.
Thanks. All right, so this is zoning bylaw 580. This is a summary of changes and public feedback, and we have our senior policy planner, Mr. Sam Hogg.
Good evening. Just making sure you can hear me. Thanks. So good evening, Mayor and Council. So, oh wow, strange hearing my own voice. So my name is Sam Hogg. I'm a senior policy planner at the district. So as you know, the district is repealing zoning bylaw 25 and replacing it with zoning bylaw 580. The purpose of this presentation is to give an update on the new zoning bylaw and give an overview on recent changes and the feedback we've received since first reading. So second reading will be coming on July 20th, so later, a little bit later in the summer. And I'll leave some time for questions later after the presentation. I have Andrew and Sven here who can help me with that. So moving on, so looking at the timeline of where we are right now, we've moved past first reading, and the referral period ends on July 4th. And staff have been incorporating public feedback since first reading and have been moving that into the draft bylaw. And the next public version will be released on the 20th when we get to second reading. And then public hearing and adoption are both scheduled for the fall, with public hearing looking like it's going to be in September. Looking at one of the probably the most significant change that's being made with this second reading draft, we're moving towards including a density bonus for rental housing. So the purpose of this change is to encourage the development of new rental housing, specifically in the RM1, C1, and C4 zones. So this change encourages density in central areas of the district with the condition that it's secured as rental tenure with using a housing agreement. So rental projects in the RM1, the C1, and the C4, they'd be allowed to build up to double the base density. So that means up to 2.8 FAR and 100 units per hectare for projects in the RM1 and the C4, and then up to 1.6 FAR and 50 units per hectare in the C1. And then social housing projects would also qualify under this bonus as well. They'd be considered rental. So ultimately, this is a relatively simple change which is in alignment with the OCP, and it tries to tip the scales to make rental more viable and to make it balance with strata projects. Just moving on, looking at these next points, rental development is inherently less profitable, and it's less likely to generate a land lift. So strata projects would still be able to go through a rezoning process, and we'd still capture value or through payments towards an amenity contribution or towards the Affordable Housing Fund. And rental projects are less valuable or less profitable given the context of the Sunshine Coast. So given issues around a lack of labor and cost of supplies, and also lower market rents, these rental projects, they've been confirmed through analysis from urban systems that they're less likely to generate a land lift. Moving on and looking at some of the smaller changes that are being made as well through this update. There's been lots of formatting changes, so giving a more consistent format, making changes to the M1 zone as well. So including live work units as well as tourist accommodation and tourist commercial as uses. So changes to strengthen the mixed use zone in the M1. And then also we've made some smaller changes to parcels where they're being changed to incorporate the existing use. Just looking at some public comments we've received and kind of like a major theme from the comments we've received from the public. There were lots of comments surrounding the changes being made to the R1 zone, so specifically removing the second primary dwelling for lots smaller than 4,000 square meters. This is also true in the RU2 as well, where there've been lots of comments around removal of the second primary dwelling. So the new bylaw tries to follow the intent of the OCP by limiting expansion to unserviced areas, while also opening up new opportunities for accessory dwellings across the district. So on the whole, there's a very large net increase of opportunities for new infill across the district. So that includes laneway houses and then a large expansion of secondary suites as well. So overall, this update vastly, sorry, as I said, so if you look at the table on the right there, the rows, it's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but the rows show the existing zoning and the columns show the proposed zoning. So you can see in the AG1 and the RU2 with the red, thank you, with the red check marks. Those two zones are seeing a decrease in opportunities for new infill, but the green check marks and the green check marks show where there's a net increase in those where that zone's going to change, and the yellow is both an increase and a decrease, and the gray is where there's no change at all. So overall, there's a significant increase in new opportunities for infill. But still, as a response to these public comments, staff are proposing increasing the maximum size of the accessory dwelling of the detached. We're changing the terminology of the detached accessory dwelling from 90 to 120 square meters, and that's just to help homeowners who had expressed to us they had previous plans to build a second primary home. Just looking quickly at some other topics that have come up in public comments. As I mentioned, the density changes. Also, lots of comments around the zoning changes that are happening to people's existing properties, and we've done our best to try and weigh the OCP and the intentions of the OCP while trying to limit negative impacts on homeowners. Also, lots of technical questions that have been incorporated. And then finally, lots of questions or lots of comments around parking and transportation, and people writing in support of building stronger active transportation networks, and comments that will be incorporated into the next like downtown plan and the parking study that's planned for the fall or planned for the future. Just looking at one place where we're looking for some council direction. So as I noted before, there were many comments surrounding the removal of the second primary home and the second primary dwelling in the R1. And staff are considering some kind of small density payment, which would account for the cost of increased services or the cost of servicing these rural properties, which would allow homeowners to build a second single family home on R1 lots that are less than 4,000 square meters. And we're looking for direction from council to proceed on this issue. And then finally, just looking at next steps and where we're going in the near future. So we're still waiting for feedback from some referral groups. As I mentioned, our referral period ended on the 4th, so Monday. And we'll be summarizing those comments in the second reading report, which will be on the 20th. And the next draft will be available on the district's Have Your Say page. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, and my two colleagues are here as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, who wants to dive in first? Okay. Councillor Lamb?
There you go. For suites in a house, So what's, my understanding, if you have a house at a suite, would the maximum size is 750 square feet? Or can it be larger than that?
So presently, I believe in the first reading draft, there was no size limit for suites specifically stated. But functionally through the BC Building Code, there is a limit on the size of a secondary suite in that it has to be less than the principal living space in a dwelling. So it would have to be at least below 50% of the main home area.
Sorry, can I ask a clarification? So you're saying it has to be smaller than the living area. So in other words, if you've got a main floor, that's the primary living area, the suite, if it's in the basement, has to be smaller than the upstairs, not necessarily 50% smaller than the main floor, but it has to be less than 50% of the whole living space. Is that correct?
That's right. So if you had a 1,200 square foot home, your suite could be up to 600 or 590 square feet.
Okay, thank you. Any further follow-up, Councillor Lamb?
Yeah, I guess the initial, kind of the background behind that is if a person wanted to put in a like a 3-bedroom suite. So 3-bedroom suite, you probably, you got to be about 900 square feet. So you'd have, your main house would have to be 2,000 square feet before you could do that. If you had a house that was 2,000 square feet, you could put in a 1,000 square foot rental unit.
That's right.
Thank you, Councillor McLean.
Yeah, so kind of on the same line as Councillor Lamb, but just trying to understand the difference between an auxiliary dwelling unit and either a secondary home or the primary home. So I think the biggest difference is the size limitation. Are there any other differences in terms of building code or anything like that when we're talking about either adding a second home to a lot or an auxiliary dwelling unit?
Thank you, and I'll take that question. And if I may, afterwards, I could add just a little more clarity to Councillor Lamb's question. So primarily, a dwelling is a dwelling per the BC Building Code, no matter the size. And so it has to meet certain criteria to qualify as a dwelling. So there's no fundamental difference in that regard. The revised version of second reading bylaw, which you'll see, will allow a slight modification in a rear yard setback if the property borders onto a lane. So typically it'd be 5 meters, but if there's a lane back there, a secondary dwelling could have a 1.5 meter setback. But that's fundamentally the only difference, because it is a dwelling which requires to be on a foundation, requires a kitchen and plumbing and electricity and so forth. So fundamentally, they're all dwellings. It's just how we size them. And particularly in the outlying areas, the Sandy Hooks, Tuanix, or the other side of town, for example, we feel it's important to create a relationship between principal and accessory or auxiliary. So you, as a property owner, you can understand that it's a singular property. It has 2 dwellings and there's a principal and accessory relationship. What we've seen over time is when there are 2 primary dwellings on a property, invariably there's demand for subdivision because you don't have that primary and accessory relationship. And then quite often you have this on a property due to lack of sanitary sewer or roads or whatnot, does not qualify for subdivision and creates some level of hardship for owners down the line. And that's fundamentally why we're trying to look at distinguishing the size difference. And that does lend in a little bit to the previous question regarding size. Traditionally, bylaws on the Sunshine Coast, including District of Sechelt and rural area bylaws for SCRD, refer to a 55 square meter maximum. And I'm not entirely sure where that came from, but this zoning bylaw and others, such as zoning bylaw in SCRD, have been underway for such a period of time that the BC Building Code used to use 90 square meters as the difference between a suite and a duplex. But that's what's changed. Now you can have a suite, 90 square meters being roughly 1,000 square feet. Now you can have more, and it's not a duplex. And duplex has a higher level of building code in terms of fire separations and non-combustible fixtures and plumbing and so forth. And so the difference now, as our staff indicated, is that just the size difference, that the main house is bigger than the suite. And so that's why we came forward initially with 90 square meters, because that was sort of the rule of thumb we've been using for the last couple of years. But receiving a fair amount of feedback in the last couple of months, realizing we're not bound by 90, we propose 120. So 120 being closer to 1,400 square feet, for example, for that secondary dwelling. And a suite contained within wouldn't have a size restriction. So I hope that was helpful and not further muddying. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McLean.
Yeah, that was absolutely helpful. Thank you, Director Allen. But just as a follow-up for more clarity, I hear the mention of lower setbacks for the auxiliary dwelling unit. Are there any other impacts about the difference between a secondary home and an auxiliary dwelling unit? I'm thinking like DCCs, site servicing fees, or anything like that.
Not so much in terms of fees, but the impact upon secondary dwellings on properties outside of our sanitary sewer service area and needing a second septic field. In some cases, if you have a suite within a house, that suite might only be one bedroom and it can contribute towards the approved septic field size. But when you get into a second home, you need a fair amount of land to have a second septic field. And that's kind of that threshold why some properties in the R1 zone, for example, need a certain size threshold to qualify for an additional dwelling or to qualify for a particular size.
Sorry, and I think Vancouver Coastal Health weighs in on that too, right? As to how much land you need, even though we have septic systems right now that don't necessarily require as much land, Vancouver Coastal Health is the one that determines what we have to follow. Is that correct?
Vancouver Coastal Health plays quite an active role in subdivision because you're creating a new parcel that doesn't yet exist. They utilize the municipal sewage regulations when it comes to building permits on existing dwellings, and the registered wastewater professional who, is a professional who's bound by guidelines in the municipal sewage regulations, but will design the septic field and determine the load primarily based on bedrooms, but also based on house size. For example, I recall one time a 7,000 square foot 2-bedroom home clearly has more fixtures and more capability of sewage load than a 2-bedroom cottage, for example. So it's a little bit of a mixture of the two. But they would leave that part of it to professional reliance.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Scott.
So the second dwelling would require a completely separate field. You couldn't size a single field to cover both?
Most likely would require a second field if it's larger than just a very small cottage. That comes down to standards in terms of, is it a 4-bedroom house and a 3-bedroom house, and that's quite a large septic field. So in many cases, it's a second field.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
All right, I don't see any other hands up. I have some questions about the conversation around land lift and rentals and the FAR and the hectares, how many units per hectare. So I didn't quite follow the conversation when you talked about, the land lift, if it's rentals or stratas, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you could revisit that conversation.
Sure, yeah. So I guess, yeah, specifically looking at the density. So the density is the max allowed in the OCP. So I believe the OCP, sorry, I can pull it up here. So we're essentially just allowing a doubling of the density, which is so allowing the maximum allowed in the OCP, and then looking at the land lift. So just because of the cost of building on the coast is so high, and then the value you're creating from rental is quite a bit lower because you're looking at a cap rate over. You're looking at the 1-year value of a rental building. So it's so rentals typically looked at. I believe they kind of look at it as a better long-term investment. There's less of a turnaround right away. So this would allow them to. I'm terrible at explaining things, sorry.
You're saying that because they're doing a rental, their return isn't as high up front. It takes them longer to recoup their investment. And so we're allowing them a little more density to allow that to happen.
Essentially, yeah. It's just trying to make it's trying to weigh the two sides a little bit better. Because strata will always be kind of a better, it'll always look more inviting early on. And this is just trying to weigh the playing field a little bit.
So what you're saying is we're giving more of a lift to rentals as compared to somebody who's building a strata property.
No, what I would say is that if you look at like a valuation, the cost to build rental, what our consultant told us is that the cost to build rental will almost always, in the scenarios we're looking at in Seashell, it'll almost always outweigh the value. So you're almost always creating negative land lift. So essentially the value of the land is decreasing by building a rental building. And so typically with a strata project, we look for 75% of that land lift, so the value that's being created. We try and secure that. That's typically how it's done. You try and secure that as some sort of amenity payment. But what our consultant's telling us is that there's essentially a rental project is decreasing the value of the land. So there's really nothing we could ask for them at these densities. If you're looking at like a 20-story building, we could start looking for some sort of payment, but at these densities, that's not the case.
Thank you. That makes it clear. All right. Any other? Councillor Lamb.
There you go. Just changing the pace here for a second. I'm just wondering about industrial properties. Are you getting much feedback with regards to the changes you want to make? And it comes back to me, I guess, that I'm not really happy about the 9-meter setback from the front property line. So I'm just wondering if we're getting any feedback with regards to that.
I think you were talking about before about commercial versus industrial, whereas commercial typically doesn't have the required setback, but industrial does? Okay. I'd like to take that one.
I could take that
Director
one.
Allen.
Oh, and yes, thank you. We have Mr. Hall available virtually as well, and he's been handling a few of the industrial inquiries. Thanks, Ian.
Sure. Specifically regarding the 9-meter setback, I certainly haven't had any comments related to that. We've certainly had comments around sort of permitted uses and a few comments around height and density and things, but I can't recall any specific to the 9-meter setback. There's certainly been some interest in the industrial zone and comments coming as well related to just the change from sort of the existing industrial zones in bylaw 25, where it's kind of a hodgepodge in all the zones and there's not a clear distinction between sort of light industrial and heavy industrial. There's lots of uses kind of mixed in together within the same zone, and what we're trying to do in 580 is really differentiate between light and heavy industrial uses and separate those into distinct zones. So we've certainly had feedback on the land use side of things, but when it comes to sort of specific setbacks, I don't recall anything there. But.
Mr. Allen?
I'm just quickly trying to check and cross-compare to zoning bylaw 25, our present zoning bylaw. And the I-7 zone, for example, does have a 9-meter setback in place. I think that industrial uses are quite often more an industrial park-like setting in the middle of a bigger property as opposed to a streetscape setting, and that might be one of the primary differences. These are things that can be considered through particular development permit applications where we refine details based on the proposal. So the zoning bylaw is the overall standard, and it can be varied or supplemented in a development permit when there's a site-specific case for it.
All right, you're back with us. We don't just see your shoulder. All right. The other question, any other questions, comments from council? Councillor Toth.
Thank you. So just I'm going to latch onto the auxiliary dwelling unit detached. You can have an attached auxiliary dwelling unit of effectively any size based on the size of the principal house. And if you wanted to have a detached garage, studio, workshop, there is a table in the new zoning bylaw that scales the limit of that structure based on the size of the lot. I'm just wondering if staff gave any contemplation to whether it would be feasible or viable to look at scaling a detached auxiliary dwelling unit based on a similar concept. You could have smaller lots that might be okay for a guest cabin or something like that, and then the larger lots would be able to accommodate secondary dwellings, scaled appropriately to a lot. Thank you.
Is there anything, I guess this is talking about, is there anything in there about lot coverage?
I mean, there is lot coverage in there, but like when I'm talking specifically around the 90 square meter limit, the table, I don't have it handy, but the table's on page 74 of the new zoning bylaw for auxiliary structures, that are not dwellings, garages, things like that, so.
Yeah, Mr. Kobowitz?
I can speak to that a little bit. So, of course, as Sam had indicated, we are in the subsequent readings proposing 120 meters, which would be a fairly substantial increase. It is fairly generous for an accessory dwelling unit that you would typically see. The other thing to keep in mind is that on properties that are smaller, you'll often have many other limits that might cause that accessory dwelling unit to be smaller, such as setbacks, parcel coverage. So on a 900 square meter lot, for example, where accessory dwelling units will be permitted, fitting a 120 square meter unit on a lot, you're going to hit other limits as well. Likely, and you may be referring to unserviced areas, larger rural properties, where again, if we look at that table, certainly a sliding scale is possible, but 120 meters is already fairly generous for that. And once you get smaller than that, you would be looking at much smaller property sizes as well.
Thank you. So just as a follow-up then, that 120 square meters would include any garage space that you might want to build as part of that dwelling. I guess the idea, if you're looking at a carriage house or a garage in the front, some living space, and then a second floor, the structure may not be that large of a footprint, but volume-wise, it could certainly exceed that 120 square meters.
So currently that building would be limited to 120 square meters of floor area, including any other enclosed space, including a garage. You could still utilize your accessory building floor area allowances and have a detached garage somewhere else on the property.
All right, any other questions? I don't see any other hands up. Councillor McLean, then Councillor Toth.
I'll just jump into a comment quickly here. Just to summarize the comments that I've heard, the people that reached out to me, two major concerns is they want to be able to continue to offer a second house on their lot. So that was a lot of these R3 to R1 conversions that we're seeing. And the other one is looking at how we increase housing options. So how do we get more rental options on the Sunshine Coast in Sechelt? And I think both of those options are really nicely summed up right at the bottom of page 61, where it recognizes that it's a small change that fits with the intent of the zoning update, setting a good foundation for moving everything forward. So I think I like what I'm seeing here. It kind of meets both of the needs that I've heard from the community. So I look forward to continuing to move this forward.
Councillor Toth.
Thank you. On a slightly related note, which may bring us back to, I think, where we're trying to go here, the bonus density payment that's being suggested or contemplated within the R1 zone. Do staff at this point have an idea of what a modest payment would look like? Is that, limited in floor area at that 120 square meters or something less? I think that's where we're supposed to be going with the conversation anyways, so I'll just jump right in with my question. Thanks.
Question is, do we have a sense of what a modest payment might be in a hypothetical sense? Well, we have the community amenity and affordable housing policy, and that speaks to payments respecting creating new titles, right? So creating an additional dwelling on an existing title is perhaps more modest than that. Thinking back to the Bounty rezoning on Acorn Road a couple of years ago where we had more modest, and that's carried over into this bylaw, and I think that was in and around that 2,500 to 3,000 mark approximately, if I recall correctly. So somewhere less than the creation of a title, I suspect, is likely the most fair and reasonable in that regard.
Thank you. That's what I thought you were, that's what I thought we were going with that, but I just wanted to sort of get a little better idea on that. And then the follow-up question is would it be that any R1 lot would be eligible to apply under that? Or is it intended, again, that you need to meet a certain minimum size? Or is that going to be up to council to suggest? Thanks.
For the R1 properties, let's assume they're located outside of the sanitary sewer service area. That's the intent of the low density residential zoning. We've used a 2,000 square meter benchmark for a separate detached dwelling. That's historically, traditionally been the benchmark that we've used that meets the comfort zone of Vancouver Coastal Health when it comes to finding soil on site for sewage. It's not a strict absolute. There are some properties that are 1,500 square meters that have great soil, and there are 2,000 plus square meter properties that are probably steep bedrock, right? So Sandy Hook, a lot of challenging properties. Some are bigger, some are smaller. So, you know, it's not an absolute. That's the benchmark that we've used for that purpose. It is kind of a consistent rural standard and is a benchmark that's utilized in Half Moon Bay and Roberts Creek and other areas that are unlikely to see sanitary sewer even in the lifetime of the next OCP and zoning bylaw round moving forward. So there is some possibility there. But I would suggest we need to try and be reasonable and find something that works and treat some of our sewer serviced areas a little bit differently than our outer-lying areas. That's why staff have come up with this.
Councillor Scott?
As far as feedback goes, I would be in favor of looking at a density bonusing for R1 in some sort of scale, you know, not black and white, but certainly look at a lot and see what's workable for sure. It all helps.
All right, so then at the end of your presentation, you indicated that there was something you wanted feedback from us on. Could you reiterate what that is?
I can pull it up again, but it's exactly that. Yeah, so just ask, or I can share my screen, sorry. Yeah, so it's this here. Yeah. So looking at I guess the exact wording, allowing the development of a second single unit dwelling or a second primary dwelling, giving a moderate density bonus payment.
So for those who have been coming to us and saying, we are limiting their development options because of the changes we're making, this will give them the option, if they could provide sewer, et cetera, and a small bonus payment to actually put the second dwelling in.
That's correct, and also understanding that many of these cases they can already build an accessory dwelling unit. So essentially, just bumps them up from that 120 square meters to a full size primary dwelling.
Thank you. All right, Councillor Kuster.
I just have a quick clarification question from Director Allen earlier. Just it takes me a minute to formulate what I'm going to say. Did you say, so the R1 properties that are currently, like in our current zone, even though they are allowed to build two dwellings, they may be limited by the sewer, and then so they can't actually build two zones, even though they thought they may have?
Well, that's entirely possible. Zoning is the premise of what you could potentially do in your property. And then there's other layers that apply, development permit areas. If you may have 2,500 square meters of property and half of that might be in a ravine. So you own this density per se, but you realistically have to be able to utilize it too, right? And so that's part of it. The other part of it is this 2,000 square meters is a size that was selected at some point in the past about what's appropriate for dwelling density when you're not on sewer. And we've just been utilizing that standard. And there might be a bigger question about whether or not that's still the appropriate amount of land. But that really then gets down into that site-specific analysis of soils and safety of land and so forth.
Is that also identified in the OCP?
Yes, there's that table in the OCP, and it talks about in order to achieve the maximum density, it says you should be on sanitary sewer. And that's the 4 units. I'll pass it over to Sven. I know he knows it, and as do I. It's just drawing a blank right now.
Yeah, the 2,000 square meters is actually slightly more aggressive than the OCP suggests. So the base density for the low density residential is actually 4 units per hectare, which works out to 2,500 square meters per dwelling unit. And so in our case, we've also included a secondary suite kind of in that package, since we've always historically included secondary suites as sort of not counting it as part of the number of units per hectare. So the bylaw amendments as are suggested now are slightly over and above what the OCP itself says right now. The maximum density in the low density residential with sewer service is suggested at 10 units per hectare, which is about 1,000 square meters per single family home.
So if we were to revisit that 2,000 square meters, that's probably when we're going to be looking at our OCP amendment, going out to the community, finding out what kind of density they want to see on these bigger lots, and then that would then be reflected in a new zoning bylaw amendment. Is that correct? Is that kind of how we're seeing this play out?
Yeah, I'd say that's correct. I mean, our stated project goal here for the past couple of years is to say we're implementing that policies contained within the OCP. We've pushed those limits a little bit where appropriate. But if we're going to redraw that and say 1,000 square meters is now appropriate because it's 2023, but that's a conversation, number one, to have with the community, number two, to have with Vancouver Coastal Health and what their thoughts are on septic fields and increasing technology over time. Technology is increasing, but with that comes higher maintenance requirements for septic fields, and without a regulatory oversight and just pushed onto property owners, that can be problematic as well. Systems that require power, for example, that are not just your standard drip run type septic fields. So there's opportunities and challenges, and I think that's the next step that we need to look at.
All right, Councillor McLean.
Hello. Okay. Sorry about that. I guess the question is with this one, why? We've kind of talked about allowing 120 square meters for auxiliary dwelling units on R1, which is a pretty decent size. We heard earlier from Director Allen about the concern about kind of having 2 primary homes and that encouraging subdivision. So I think there needs to be some kind of balance here, because my primary goal with this is allowing property owners to have an option and trying to encourage those rental type buildings. So the rental auxiliary dwellings. But what this does is moves us back towards a subdivision and ownership type model. So yes, we can get a little extra payment out of the property owner, but I think like Mayor Seegers was mentioning, like some of these harder conversations are more appropriate for an OCP. And like once we get this done, we need to seriously look at the OCP. To have Davis Bay and Tuanet considered as the same kind of area, that's I think inappropriate. I think we need to really think about what the vision is for each of our neighborhoods. So I think there needs to be a lot more of this fine-tune work done, and I don't know if now is the time for this. I want to make sure that this remains an administrative type update where we're trying to also modernize, but not going too far and setting a vision for what our neighborhoods look like. So I need to see a really strong reason why this is better than just allowing 120 square meter auxiliary dwelling units.
So are you saying you're not necessarily in favor of the density bonus in the R1 zone? Is that what you're leaning towards?
Yeah, I want to see a strong case in why this is advantageous, because I don't see it right now.
Thank you. I don't know if staff want to answer that at this point. Maybe let you think about that. We'll come back. Councillor Todd.
Thank you. It's just a clarification for my own thoughts, because when I was reading this, I misunderstood this. I thought that this would be a means for lots that were, say, smaller than that 2,000 square meters to be able to qualify for a detached auxiliary dwelling unit. Recognizing that that's not the case as written, I sort of agree with what Councillor McLean's saying. You know, we are in the midst of a housing crisis. Anything that we can do to increase the number of properties that can have an auxiliary detached dwelling unit, I think we should be taking, even if that does mean we have to step over the OCP slightly. But yeah, I think that this runs the risk of just being two primary homes on a property, which is not necessarily what we need. Thanks.
All right, did anybody want to address that kind of direction? Everybody's looking at everybody else.
I mean, thank you. Great question. It truly is something that we've got another week until the next agenda is published, and you see the second reading report next Friday. It gives us a little bit of time to try and come up with something, understanding that there's an opportunity, but there's also future work to be done. We have all kinds of policy work that we need to do in Sechelt relating to housing, relating to parking in downtown, and we're trying to accomplish this. And we've always wrestled with this dilemma of accomplishing and completing versus trying to solve all of the issues that we were aware of, right, and trying to strike that balance. So frankly, I think I'm dancing around it a little bit. I'll sum it up by saying we'll see what we can come up with in the next week that might be suitable.
That sounds good. All right, any final comments or questions about the, Mr. Allen?
Quick, after you. Okay, I just want to say, to sum this up, if I may, we're not asking, other than perhaps some direction on that topic, we're not asking for a reading or a specific firm decision this evening. We will be coming back on July 20th, which is 2 weeks from tonight. And so you'll see the new and improved second reading version of the bylaw by next Friday afternoon when the agenda is published, so several days in advance. We have received lots of excellent comments, phone calls, emails, meetings, so forth. We've made a number of changes to make it better and more clear, and we're proud of the next version that's coming. We've fallen into this trap a little bit. We are already working on the next version, forgetting that, you know, everybody else still has the original version, so we'll be pleased to share that. It does give us August 3rd, the council after that as a back pocket if we need to come back again and potentially try and resolve this density bonus issue, so we have a bit of flexibility. In terms of referrals, we've heard from another number. We have a preliminary approval from the Ministry of Transportation. They're on board because they ultimately have to approve the bylaw. Ministry of Agriculture and Food, Vancouver Coastal Health. There's a couple more that have come in that are supporting the direction, like from that provincial agency level. Still waiting and hoping to hear soon from Sechelt Nation and continuing to work on that end of things. And we will be back in front of you at next council meeting.
Thank you. Councillor Todd.
Thank you. Recognizing that the agenda for the 20th comes out the Friday before, is there a plan to re-forward the new version of the bylaw out to the community associations, sort of early process to allow them to try and get some feedback before we go to public hearing?
Yes, absolutely. Standard practice is to get it on a published agenda, and council has the first crack at it, even if it's only a minute or 5 minutes before we send it out. But yes, I think it's something we've talked about internally, sharing it and posting it on our webpage, the Your Safe page, but also emailing it out to our established contacts. Thank you.
I want to say thank you for all the work you guys have done. This has been a huge undertaking, many years in process. And I mean, I know we kind of pushed a bit, but I think in the end, we're all going to be really happy with where this takes us. But it's you guys at the front line who've been leading this. So thank you for that. We do appreciate it. All right, let's move on to item 10.2. Development permit application for development permit for 5638 Inlet Avenue, Sunshine Coast Community Services Society. And Mr. Kobrowitz is joining us again.
Thank you. Pleased to present tonight for your consideration the development permit for 5638 Inlet Avenue, which is the site of the Sunshine Coast Community Services project. This project is presently located in a commercial 2 zone that was amended last year to allow for a 6-story apartment building with mixed office and programming uses for community services, and with that being subject to a housing agreement that was considered earlier tonight. It is within the downtown center land use designation where development permit area number 6 for downtown Seashelt applies for commercial uses, as well as development permit area number 7 for multiple family residential. This development permit must be issued prior to a building permit being authorized. So the proposal is for 34 units of affordable housing intended for women and women with children. The first 2 floors are for office space and community programming space, including the food bank. There's outdoor community spaces for gardens, a play space, as well as bike storage facilities for residents and staff. The project will also be subject to BC Housing Design Guidelines and covenanted accessibility standards that were part of the rezoning process. DPA 6 for downtown Seashelt focuses on commercial buildings in the downtown, and the objectives are to establish a high level of urban design and quality aesthetics for downtown buildings. The principal focus is also on pedestrian-oriented street-level facades. For multiple family residential, the objectives focus on livability and the appropriate integration with the surrounding neighborhoods. Staff have reviewed all of the guidelines in both development permit areas and consider that a sufficient number of them have been addressed, considering the constraints of the project, the context of the project, and the unique characteristics of the siting. Just a brief overview of the site plan. The main entrance to the parking area is off of Lamprey Lane to the rear, with access off of Wharf Avenue. There will be a new pedestrian pathway constructed along Lamprey Lane, consisting of a concrete sidewalk that connects through to a connection to Inlet Avenue. The area underneath the transmission lines will primarily be used for community garden space and the parking area. A fairly comprehensive landscaping program has been proposed to really elevate the amenity space that's afforded for the area underneath the transmission lines. So the recommendation from staff tonight for council is to approve the development permit 2021-31 for 5638 Inlet Avenue. And the next steps would include registration of a housing agreement, negotiation and entering into a works and services agreement for off-site works, and finally a building permit application prior to construction. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, any questions or comments? Seeing none, there is a recommendation. Councillor Kuster?
I'll move recommendation to that council approve development permit 2021-31, 5638 Inlet Avenue.
Thank you. Is there a seconder for the recommendation? Seconded. All those in favor? Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Moving on to item 10.3. 10.3 is the Engineering Operations Division Capital Projects Update. And council, any questions or comments? Councillor Toth?
Thank you. The Wharf Avenue sidewalk improvements. I see all of the hardscape is done, which is great. Do we have any concept of when, you know, plantings and things like that are going to be done? Streetlights as well. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Through your worship, plantings will be happening in fall. Right now, given we're going into the water restriction times and potentially hotter weather, I asked our parks manager this morning, and they feel that fall is probably the best time for those plantings to be planted. As for the street lights, we're doing an inventory in our yard to see if we can utilize some of the street lights we have there. So that also will be in fall. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, other questions? All right, I don't see any other questions. Thank you for the report. Appreciate it. Next up is council reports. So which end of the table do we want to start at? Or do we want to start with the ones online this time? Let's start with online. Councillor Rowe, then Councillor McLean, and then we'll start with Councillor Lamb and work our way down the table. Councillor Rowe, over to you.
Hi. Hopefully the dogs will behave here so I can get through the next minute. I did the walk on July 1st with Councillor Kuster and the parade, and took part in the festivities on July 1st, including opening our stage at Hackett Park, which was, I think it was just a fabulous day, all in all. And other than that, I think that's where I'm going to stop tonight. Thanks. Thank you. Councillor McLean.
Yeah, I just want to start by thanking everyone who had a role in CIA Days. I really appreciate the effort to make it much more inclusive and make it a real community building initiative. So thanks for that. Other than that, I attended the opening for the Jane Bowers Dog Park. It's nice to see there's probably 50 plus people out. Got to hear from some of Jane's family. It's nice to see that legacy recognized, and I was amazed of how many dogs were in that park with all the people at the same time. It's going to be a fun place, I think, and I'm looking forward to getting that gazebo installed and just kind of having that place there you can go and play with your dog in public. It's going to be a real asset to the town.
Thank you. Councillor Lamb.
Nothing to report.
Thank you. Councillor Kuster.
Okay, I attended the dog park opening as well, the Jane Bowers Dog Park, which was actually really fun. Took me a while to find parking, but it was fun. I also participated with Councillor Rowe in the Orange Shirt Walk at the July 1st parade. Then I was honored to stand on the stage with Mayor Seegers and Councillor Toth and Rowe with the opening of our Hackett Park amphitheater and stage, which is absolutely beautiful. I was really impressed with how it all looks. It was amazing. Checked out the market and the festivities, and then I headed to the Rotary Dunk Tank, where I was dunked a few times. I thought there'd be a few more people, but no, I definitely got wet. It was fun. And what else? And APC last night. I think that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Toth.
Let's see. Took part, in the organization of CIA Canada Day again this year. Things went decently well. Some lessons for next year with the new partnership. The culture and park staff were absolutely amazing to work with on this, as they are every year. And I think that the community really appreciated being able to get back together in person again. Standing on that stage, you know, looking out during the blanketing ceremony and the mayor's remarks is really cool to see just a sea of orange, primarily. Hardly any red and white out there that day. Yeah, so it was really good, and I was really glad to be able to be there on the 1st. That's really all I have for district stuff. Due to timing, of course, I did announce at the regional district that I'll be seeking re-election. The Coast Reporter had a good article about it, posted half an hour after I made that announcement, and it was in last week's paper, so I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Scott.
Nothing to report on my end.
All right, I will talk about a few things. I've attended a number of meetings over the last couple of weeks with regards to RCMP funding. So Union of BC Municipalities had a town hall on policing. There was the Mayor's Forum in the Lower Mainland with our division of RCMP. We did, the CAO and CFO and I attended a session put on by Fort St. John around RCMP funding. And then we had the quarterly policing update here with the other local governments. So 3 things that have really come out of those meetings that we want to make the community aware of and council aware of. There are going to be some pressures on our budget. One is the contract settlement, which we've talked about before, but 2016 was the last time the RCMP had an actual contract, because then they went into union negotiations. They went to set up the first union, et cetera. So there were no contracts since that time frame, and we were all asked as municipalities to put aside 2.5% for an increase each year, and we did that. And now that they've finally settled, it's actually turned out to be 3.5% per year on average. So there are many municipalities who are needing to pay RCMP, prior year costs, don't have the funds to do that. So that's one pressure. Another one is the body-worn cameras that have been mandated by the federal government. And there are 2 components to that. One is going to be the equipment itself, but then the other is going to be actually having staff to manage the data that gets collected. For example, if they're looking at using some of the data, they may have other people in the cameras. Those faces need to be, blocked out, et cetera. So there's going to have to be a lot of training and a lot of staff, potentially municipal staff, which we will have to pay for to do that kind of work. And then the final one that we've heard about is e-com upgrades. Again, mandated by the federal government, requires updates to equipment and processes, and those costs may end up coming down on us as well. So what the Union of BC Municipalities is doing is requesting that the federal government help ease the burden of some of those costs and phase them in so that we don't get hit with those all at once, because they are potentially coming to us like next year and year after, and that's a lot of money. So that's one of the items that we've been looking at over the last while. June is graduation month. Sorry, did you have a question about that?
I did have a question about that. Just with the RCMP funding pressures, are our staff looking at that, and are we going to find out how that's going to impact us here before we enter the budget cycle? I know that the Public Safety Reserve does have a substantial amount in it at this time. Is that intended to cover the back pay and what have you?
Douglas.
Thank you, through the chair. We shouldn't have a budgetary impact in 2023. We do have funds in the Public Safety Reserve, but we also have had, we've set up a liability account to cover our portion of the wage increases.
The RCMP had indicated that we would be getting the information within the last couple of months. Now, because of the pushback that's been happening, I think they've held that back. I don't think we actually have an amount yet, do we? Go ahead.
Through the chair, no, we don't have an amount, firm amount yet, but we are also going through the UBCM's process and participating there as well. Yeah,
so more information to come, but just kind of laying the groundwork for you. June is graduation month, so I attended 3 graduation ceremonies. I attended the alternate school, Chattelich, and the Seashell Nation for the grade 12 and the post-secondary. And Chattelich and Elphinstone both indicated that we have a very generous community. Chattelich said they had 77 grads this year. It's the smallest graduating class they've had, but they estimated they had about $150,000 worth of bursaries. So, and Elphinstone said about the same. I think they said 160 or something, so somewhere in that. So thank you to the community on behalf of our students. It really does set them up for their next steps. National Indigenous Peoples Day, I attended along with our MP, the Métis celebration that they had over at Seaside Center. I didn't stay for the jigging. I went off on to another event, but some of them stayed with jigging, and I think there's some incriminating pictures out there. I attended, along with Councillor Toth, a Lifetime Achievement Award presented to Annie Akuliak, the Inuit artist, who we attended her home, and it actually ended up being just a few days before she passed away. And her funeral has now been scheduled for Monday, the 11th at St. Hilda's. What else have I got here? Sunshine Coast governments, District of Seashell, Gibsons, and the SCRD got together last week, Monday, to talk about meeting requests with ministers at Union of BC Municipalities, because those requests had to be in on Friday of this past week. They gave us a shortened timeline to actually get this done. So we pulled together a meeting, and each municipal government has submitted those. So we'll now wait to see which ones are accepted and when they'll be scheduled. I attended the Housing Action Table meeting. They have come out with a draft strategic plan. They presented it to us, and they were looking at how they would roll that out. Great feedback from all the organizations. It was an in-person meeting at the Capilano University, so it's pretty cool. I attended the Gibsons RGA public hearing. So now instead of short-term rentals, they're calling it residential guest accommodation. They had some feedback, not a lot, and they're going to be moving forward. Theirs is in some ways a little similar to ours, and others a little different, of course. They are looking at phasing out the temporary use permits for the commercial operators within 3 to 5 years. That's what the draft is. And some of the people who came on indicated they should phase them out in 2 years. So we'll see what they end up doing. I attended the Steve Sleep retirement party on Saturday. So yes, Friday was July 1st. So July 2nd, I attended Steve Sleep's retirement party. Steve Sleep worked for Coast Cable, Eastlink TV, whatever you want to call it. He was doing the community television part. And he went out doing the commentary for the July 1st parade. And he chose July 1st because when he started, it was on July 1st. So he's not going anywhere. He said he's going to be around volunteering, but he did the handoff of keys to Brittany Broderson, even though she's not been actually identified as who's going to take over from him. I think that's enough. Any questions for any of the councillors on their reports? Councillor Toth, SCRD report.
Thank you. Board reports there. I just have one thing to add to it, which is that the SCRD recently has taken the decision to start limiting the ability to comment on their Facebook posts. Staff have been spending an unreasonable amount of time curating highly inappropriate and off-topic comments. So they're going to leave the ability to post on, emergency preparedness and posts like that, but just general information updates. They're no longer able to comment on Facebook. They are trying to steer more of the actual engagement and back and forth over to the Let's Talk page. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Any questions for Councillor Toth? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 12.1, council correspondence. I'd like a motion to receive. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. I know this has been getting a lot of input from the community. It's been advertised in the newspaper. I don't know, I haven't heard it on the radio, but they may have put it on there as well. And I know they've posted on Facebook. So we're encouraging the community to get involved and give some feedback. I know one of the things that we've heard, particularly from the Highway 101 route, whatever they're called, the group, is that there's no alternate route that's been proposed from Havies through to Wharf Avenue. And given that this plan is looking 20, 25 years into the future, I think that's a real shortcoming. So I'm encouraging everybody to put your input in and let what you'd like to say be presented to Modi. Councillor Toth.
I didn't get a chance to attend both of the information sessions, but I did attend the first one. And they were, I think they said they had like 28 attendees. And they were real proud of that, which in a community of 30,000 people is pretty poor. So I think it's important that people do find out about it, that people do get back to Modi about what they think about what's being proposed. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of highlight that point.
All right, next item, and he's ready. Are there any emergency items?
No emergency items, Your Worship.
Thank you. I'd look for a motion to adjourn. Moved, seconded, all in favor? Thank you. All right, any questions or comments? Okay, would you like to come to the microphone, please? Yeah, come to the microphone, please. Come to the microphone, please, because we have people online that want to hear as well.
The meeting's also virtual, so no one will hear you that isn't in this room.
Okay.